So, Mike, any word on anything?
They just keep sending out emails, stay tuned. That's all we hear.
There was a third case just confirmed.
Yeah, from somebody that had been to Europe.
Yeah.
So what
Third
happens
case in Utah?
Yeah.
if it gets canceled?
Okay, so if
I
it
take
get,
your money and retire.
Yeah.
so far the only money we can't get back is from the Dolphin Hotel. The rest, the next deadline coming up will be the 27th of March. So if we tell them we're not coming before then, cancel for then, we should get everything back. That doesn't help with your airfare. That's the only thing we can't reimburse. So you can change that to a later date. You can, somebody said that some of the airlines are letting you yeah.
They said everything is in flux. A lot of airlines like American and United have changed the rules like 4 times in the last 5 days.
Okay.
Because they're still trying to figure it out. They say, honestly, we don't know what's going to happen.
Okay.
So whether or not you can get a refund or change the travel dates, they're still making up the rules as they go.
Apparently for Delta, we can change flights
For $200 or something.
since we already paid.
But that's as of today. Who knows what's going to happen in the coming week?
Yeah, Delta normally, if you change, it's $200 to change, so.
There's some girl that's supposed to go
Yeah.
into the MTC in what, Robin, what month?
Yeah.
Well, they're
In
doing
May?
FTC training from home.
The,
now, too.
yeah, the MTC is doing all training from home from now on. And then we'll just go to your mission field straight from there.
I think it's all bogus.
So we won't know, of course,
Conspiracy
you guys don't know, but. and-
Yeah, so we're definitely keeping up with it. We haven't had anything official from BYU. We haven't heard any, the UK hasn't shut down yet. I'm not going to the Jazz game Friday, apparently. So, anyway, I just want to find somebody who has it, have them lick a
I know,
spoon
give
and
it
I'll
to
lick
us.
it and I'll get it over with and then I'm
You
fine.
can like sign up for the clinical trials of the vaccine, and then
Yeah.
they'll pay you for it.
I'd be glad to do it.
Really?
And that would pay for your airfare.
yeah, if I die, I'm comfortable. I've lived a good life. Okay,
We've seen lots of,
all right, so
carnage.
I know you're tired of Darwin, but I want to use him as a stepping stone launch pad for a discussion today that, which will be about the Murchison-Sedgwick controversy, Canberra Division controversy. Because we'll spend some time in a little bit, the day in the Welsh borders in Shropshire. So there's a thing that's been called Darwin's dilemma. The creationists and intelligent design people just love to keep beating this dead horse about how Darwinian evolution can't happen because he said you need to have time and it just happened slow. And so this Cambrian explosion shows that it had to have been, everything had to be created. So anyway, but in chapter 9, you got to give the guy credit. Chapter 6 and chapter 9, he talks about problems with his theory. He at least outlines, says, here's places, here's some legit questions that are tough to answer right now using my theory, but are just great opportunities for further research. So in the first edition, in chapter 9, this is in chapter 10 and later editions, but you'll notice I underlined slurry, and that's the main point to take away from the slide. So he says, the several difficulties here discussed, namely, are not finding in the successive formations infinitely numerous transitional links between the many species which now exist or have existed, the almost entire absence of fossiliferous formations beneath the Silurian strata are all undoubtedly of the gravest nature. Consequently, if my theory be true, it's indisputable that before the lowest Silurian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or perhaps far longer, the whole interval from the Silurian age to the present day, that during these vast and quite unknown periods of time, the world swarmed with living creatures. Why is he alluding to the Silurian as the farthest down the column that has fossils? Are there not fossils in Cambrian rocks? Are there not fossils in Ordovician rocks? So what does that tell you about the definition of the Silurian in 1859? It encompassed everything down to what we call Precambrian. Okay? And that's an artifact of what we're going to talk about. So as geology developed as a science, starting with the publication of Hutton's work in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And then that was repackaged and made a little more palatable and understandable in the 3 volumes of Principles of Geology by Lyell in the 1830s. Geology really came into its own, and a lot of what geology meant early on was a study of igneous rocks and traps and volcanics. And the other thing was stratigraphy and developing the geological timescale. When Murchison and Sedgwick started to do their work in 1831, there was one of the modern geological periods that had been named, and that was the Carboniferous. So we have to think back to, like William Smith, think back to when these scientists were doing the work. There was no such thing as a geological timescale. The Carboniferous had been named for obvious reasons, because people were interested in finding coal. So the rocks that had coal, or the carbon, so it's an adjective, they're carboniferous, they're coal bearing. That was named in 1822 in Outlines of the Geology of England and Wales by Conybeare Phillips. The Silurian system came next, and that was named by Murchison in the 1840s. The name Cambrian came from his initially friend and then later rival, Adam Sedgwick. Before they had a falling out, Murchison and Sedgwick jointly named the Devonian. Murchison headed off to the Ural Mountains for 3 or 4 years, field seasons during the late 1830s, early 1840s. And from that published 2 volumes that big on the Permian system. And then later, after Murchison and Sedgwick were dead in the 1870s, Charles Lapworth, another Brit, came in and solved the Silurian-Cambrian dilemma by injecting an intermediate period called the Ordovician. So the entire Cambrian was named by people of which nationality? British, right? And Murchison had his hand in 3 of them, and Sedgwick and so on. So this trip to England, if we're able to pull it off, when we get into the Welsh borders, we'll be in the area where at least Murchison was doing the work that led to the Silurian, and Lapworth to the Ordovician. So I just wanted to give a little background to that. And then Lyell, of course, did the stages of the Cenozoic. So the Brits had their hands all over, fingerprints all over the time scale. One of the problems with getting into the time scale, getting into the nitty-gritty of stratigraphy, is just the unwieldy number of names that you don't want to have to remember. But I just want to make this a British thing. Here's currently the Cambrian, and the Cambrian's undergoing a lot of study right now. There are currently 4 series, and it's about 48 million years long. And so a lot of time, but the 4 series, 2 of them have been named, and then these have been subdivided into stages, and a couple of those have been named. The Drumian from the Drum Mountains out in western Utah. So you can still see that there's still some work to do there. Point of this, though, is the original type Cambrian. The Comley, there's the Comley series, the lower Cambrian. And in this area is the type middle Cambrian, at least at the time then here near the Harlech Dome, as the Marionette series. So we can see that the original Cambrian did come from Britain. There's been a lot of work done since then in other places. Then we get to the Ordovician and Silurian. And We will see Caradoc on our trip. We won't get into Wales far enough to see these things, but we will see the type Wenlock, see the type Ludlovian near Ludlow. Llandovery is a little farther down south of that, and all these are of local vintage. The Pradoli, what's now the Upper Silurian, it's really not any good Upper Silurian in the type area, but over in the Czech Republic there is. So just take a look at some of these names. So here's the sign entering the little Welsh village of Llandovery. Here's the sign for the entry to Much Wenlock. We will stay a night in Ludlow, so that's the type Ludlovian. So this is Caradoc, which means this is a Welsh term for fort. So this is a Celtic fort. So there are forts on top of a lot of these peaks from back when the Romans were invading and the locals were at war with them. So that's the type locality for Caradocian. So let's look at our heroes or enemies, depending on. So here's a digital elevation model looking more or less to the north of Wales. And the red line here represents the work that had been done by William Smith mapping England, and then the survey coming in and mapping England. And then in 1822, the area was also part of a map that was in that 1822 book by Conybeare and Phillips. So this is the area that was in question in the early 1830s when Murchison and Sedgwick started doing their work. So Smith was here, this area, and I point out that the Wye River, come back to that, Bilf right along the Wye, a little bit farther north, the town of Amestry, and then Ludlow. These are going to figure into our discussion. So here's William Smith's map. How much detail there is out there. Look how little detail there is here. This is a cross-section. William Smith had a handful, or a number of cross-sections that he drew to go with the map. They're just beautiful. So I want you to picture yourself, Murchison, Sedgwick, your goal is to unravel the transition rocks. So you'll remember the Neptunian, Werner, named primary rocks, which are now what we call Precambrian igneous metamorphic. Secondary, which are these, tertiary, and in between the primary or Precambrian and the well-organized secondary was the transition, or what was also called gray wackes. So they really didn't know much about them.
By primary, you just mean just crystalline rock,
Yeah,
right?
crystalline.
Any crystalline.
Yeah, the first one's deposited out of the primordial ocean. So here's William Smith's cross-section, and so here you are. Your task now is to study these rocks, and you're going to build upon the shoulders of the people who went before. What does this suggest to you? That everything's just sort of dipping to the southeast, all the way across. And that's the model they went in with. So Conybeare and Phillips, Outlines of Geology of England and Wales, Part 1. And Conybeare, we saw his picture when we were looking at the ichthyosaurs. He's the one who named a number of Mariani's ichthyosaurs. Here's the map that was published in Conybeare and Phillips, 1822, book Part 1. Here's the old red sandstone, the Mississippian mountain limestone, the coal measures. So the blue is the Mississippian mountain limestone, the coal overlying it, and underneath it, the old red Devonian. The greens represent igneous bodies. These are this is so-called transition limestone with the hash mark.
Those are the volcanics, right? They're not intrusives, they're all extrusives.
A lot of them are extrusive, right? That's correct. Yeah, they refer to them as the traps, and so there are some, a few intrusive. But so when Murchison, or when Sedgwick collected Darwin from his home right after graduation, they headed off this way, and they wanted to enter this no person's land from something that they knew. And Conybeare, his collaborator Phillips on the first part one died. Conybeare got too busy with other things, so he went to Sedgwick and he said, would you finish part two of the outline of geology? We have done the secondary, we've done the upper part. Somebody needs to do this. So Sedgwick decided that he would do that. A little bit about Sedgwick. So here he is young, here he is old, and here he is pre-coronavirus, here he is a couple weeks after. He was born in Dent, a little town right here in northwest England. Here's what the town of Dent looks like. He was really quite a bright kid. Went to school at Cambridge, went to Trinity College, and he was excellent at math. And so that's really what he studied to begin with. And then he got roped into, or was offered the Woodwardian Chair of Geology, the first geologist at Cambridge, so he took that. And he said, hitherto I never turned a stone, henceforth I've never left a stone unturned. So once he started, he got into it. He also, later in his career, started the Sedgwick Museum, which is one of the best museums in the UK. And we'll go to if we get there, we'll go to the Sedgwick Museum. Just beautiful collections there. So his whole career, from student all the way through, for 74 years, he was associated with Cambridge.
Is that just the geology museum, or what kind of museum?
Yeah, it's just straight geology museum. It has a number of his things, a number of Darwin. It has a variety of things in it. But Sedgwick was of the mathematical school. His main interest was structural geology, if we were to characterize him today, compared to a faculty. If he was on faculty, he'd be structural geology. Sedgwick was a few years his junior. Sedgwick was born Taradell Castle in Ross-shire, up in the far, so here's Edinburgh, so way up in here. And here's some of the scenery from Ross-shire. If I can't change my tickets, I might take my wife and we'll go look at that instead. So. Here he is young, here he is older, just before he died. So he was born into a wealthy family. He went to military school. He headed off to the Peninsular War in Portugal. He worked his way up through the ranks, and then when Napoleon surrendered at Waterloo and the French army was defeated, he came back home and felt like, and he had half pay because of the time he had spent 8 years in the army. But he was really disappointed the war was over because he hadn't had a chance to really distinguish himself the way he wanted to. Very ambitious person. Came home, married the daughter of a general, and her name is Charlotte Huguenin. And I couldn't find any pictures of her, so, which is too bad, because I think she is almost as important in this story, truth be told, as he is. When he got back, he just sort of dithered away his time, went fox hunting, just did stuff that a rich guy would do. And she said, there's this new science of geology, and it sounds pretty cool. I like it. I like fossil collecting. And so she sort of shoehorned him into it, and he met Sir Humphrey Davies and was impressed and thought, yeah, I'm going to try geology. This is their longtime home in Belgravia Square in East London. This was a very fashionable, still is, very fashionable part of London. They lived at number 16 most of their married life. This is where he would depart and come back to after field seasons. He did a lot of his writing, not too far from Geological Society of London, down the Strand. If we have time, we can swing by there. Other very important people lived there. A lot of in St. James Square or in Belgravia Square. A lot of ambassadors. There were embassies there. It was a very important part of town. So he was very ambitious, and he took up geology with a passion, with a vengeance. And he had heard that Sedgwick was going to tame the Greywacke, tame the transition rocks, and he thought this would be a great opportunity. So he talked with Sedgwick. Sedgwick said, yeah, that sounds great, could use the help, let's work on it. So both of them entered into the Greywackes in 1831. Contrary to what would seem to make sense, it was not until 1834, and only for 4 weeks, and they weren't together all that time, that they actually, that's the only time they spent together. June, early July of 1834 is the only time they spent together in Wales. Otherwise, they were sort of on their own.
What qualification did Murchison have? I mean, Sedgwick was from the university, but did Murchison have any qualification?
He had joined the Geological Society of London because he was wealthy enough.
So he's rich.
And he was rich, and he was interested. So we see these two gentlemen from different backgrounds. I should mention that one of the stipulations of being the Woodwardian professor of geology was that you would not marry, because you were also a clergyman. You joined the priesthood of the Anglican Church, and to keep you from being distracted from your primary duties, you were not allowed to marry. So he was a bachelor his whole life.
So what hope did they have of actually taming these rocks? Did they think they could actually find fossils?
Yeah, they were hoping.
Okay. So,
Now, again, in 1810, there was a fellow who had gone in and done a little bit of preliminary mapping, and then somebody after him also. So it wasn't like, anyway, nobody had really.
But they're using like William Smith's methods, or what were they using? What kind of methods were they going to use?
Okay, good point. Sedgwick came from Sir Isaac Newton's University, Trinity College, Cambridge. Very math-oriented. Murchison spent time at Oxford with William Buckland, the guy who described the first dinosaur, if you remember that, the oddball guy that ate his way through the alphabet. The Oxford School was very much of a William Smith sort of thing, where it was superposition, fossils, and that type of thing. So they went started at different ends, Sedgwick up here, Murchison here, with different philosophies, with different strengths, different purposes, different ambitions. So this is Old Red. This is what came to be known as Silurian. This is, in dots, what was originally fashioned to be Cambrian. And so the idea was that beds were just dipping back that direction, getting younger as you go up section.
And Devonian was originally defined as just Old Red, right?
Right. So the Old Red was known, and was sort of the starting point. The top was the ceiling. But after they had worked it here, Sedgwick widely believed that Cambrian rocks were present down in Devonshire. But de la Beche, who was Mary Anning's good friend, who was the director of the government survey, was mapping in Devonshire, and he thought that he found coal measures. And that just didn't make sense to anybody else. They're too far down section to have coal. So what Murchison and Sedgwick did was took him on. There's a big fat book by Martin J.S. Rudwick called The Great Devonian Controversy. And, it's an interesting at the end of the day, what happened was they discovered that if you were to trace the Old Red down into Devonshire, there is what we would now call facies change. So we went from non-marine Old Red, alluvial fans and fluvial stuff coming off of, the Acadian, what do they call it over in Europe? The,
Acadian?
is it that the Hercynian? No, that's later.
Dalradian?
Yeah, okay, the Dalradian orogeny over here. So continent collision, red beds being shed both directions, that's the Old Red. But facies transition into Devonshire, there were marine rocks that had distinctive fossils. And so Murchison and Sedgwick overcame De La Beche, basically proved him wrong and came up with Devonian. Something that was younger than Silurian, but older than Carboniferous. Okay? So the two men entered their arena. Here are a couple problems right off the bat. So, in a sense, some of the same things that plagued the Devonian. So first of all, the area where Sedgwick worked. Let me go here first. So get oriented here. Here is the Bristol Channel, Severn River. Here's Pembrokeshire, Anglesey, so here's Wales, right? And here's England. Back during the Ordovician through Silurian, this is the area called the Welsh Basin. And the Welsh Basin had a shallow shelf, probably landmass out here. So in each of the maps that I'm going to show you, Anglesey is here, and Ludlow in the Welsh borders is here. So those dots will stay the same for reference. But here's the Welsh Basin. It was bounded on the south by Britannia, a landmass called Britannia. This was the Midland Shelf, and it was emergent part of the time. So there was a shallow rim around this basin, and out in Murchison's area, or Sedgwick's area, out in Wales, this was the deep water facies. Over here where Sedgwick was working, it was generally shallower facies. Which of those two facies belts do you think is going to have more fossils?
Shallow.
Shallow, right? So here's the difference. If you were Sedgwick, this is what you would see quite often. Slates, so these fine-grained, dark-colored rocks that had cleavage, right? Had plated cleavage in it from metamorphism. Here's what Murchison would see. This is the Much Wenlock limestone, your Wenlock edge. Here's what that looks like. So and even if you could get these rocks to split, would they be splitting along bedding planes to reveal the fossils? No, So in 1835, Sedgwick wrote a paper, delivered a paper at the Geological Society of London, and then published it on slaty cleavage, and that was the first paper on slaty cleavage. So he's looking at relatively deep water, fine-grained, sometimes anoxic rocks that didn't have as many fossils. Plus he was also, Élie de Beaumont, who was a French geologist, came up with the concept of a system. And he thought the Earth was shrinking. And every once in a while, there'd be this sort of cataclysmic pop because of the pressures. And when one of these systems or structural events took place, all of those rocks that were uplifted at that time would have a similar strike and dip. So when in Sedgwick, being a structural geologist and sort of math, he did a lot of strikes and dips and a lot of calculations and things like that, rather than just looking for fossils. But there is a big dome in the middle of Wales, and on the east side, the beds are dipping to the east. On the west side, they're dipping west. On the north, to the north, south to south. When he saw those different directions, he assumed that those were different tectonic events. rather than just different strikes and dips around a dome that would have formed at the same time. So, and Murchison again went in from the William Smith School looking for bedded rocks that he could identify on the basis of fossils. So you can see they're coming from sort of different avenues, different locations. So here's the Welsh Basin during what's now early Ordovician. Here it is during a little bit later in the Ordovician. So I'll just, anyway, the main thing here is that there's some complexity through time. Sea levels rising and falling. In fact, right at what's now the Ordovician-Silurian boundary, major sea level fall. But they had no idea about that. So they were fighting facies, they were fighting slight metamorphism, they were fighting structure, they were fighting sea level change, plus how good do you think the exposures are across Wales? And so they had their work cut out for them. More so Sedgwick, and that's why he ended up getting the short end of the stick. Murchison, just by dumb luck and his training, was the one who was able to initially get the upper hand. So let's go there first. So here's Murchison, 1831. He first sets foot into the transition rocks, into the Grey Wackies. And he and Charlotte take a nice vacation, a nice carriage. They go down to Cardiff and they visit some people. They had gone through Oxford and spent a little bit of time with Buckland. And then they traveled over to Swansea. And they went up to Llandilo, Llandovery. Then they went to Brecon. And there's a big faulted mountain called Brecon Beacon, and it's surrounded by Old Red. Then they went to Bilth Wells, and they went down the Wye, the drainage of the Wye River. This is where Murchison decided that maybe there was something that he could work with. So they went down the Wye to Bilth Wells. Then they headed towards Ludlow, a long strike up through Amistray, and then on to Ludlow, and then off they went, and then he came back the next year. So let's focus on this area for a second. So here's Bilth Wells, here's Brecon, here's where they entered the drainage of the Wye River. And the one thing I want you to notice is this topographic feature right here. You see that? See that hogback with a little bit of a fold right there at Ludlow and anticline, then it continues down there? That's the Wenlock limestone. And you can see that it's gently dipping back towards the southeast. So here was, here's that outcrop belt of those slightly gently dipping rocks. There's the Wye River. Okay, so here's Bilth. There's a town here called, it starts with an E. Anyway, what I'm going to show you next is a view looking down that way at the Wye River Canyon and Caversham Ferry. So here's Airwood, here's the Wye River, Bilth Wells is right here. This is Caversham Ferry. Let's zoom in on that. And if you read Murchison's notebooks, to him, he says, this is where I saw the first true Silurian. This was really my first introduction to what later became the Silurian. So here's Caversham Ferry. Now there's a bridge across there. Can you see the rocks cropping out in the river? Let's zoom in a little closer. And here's what it looks like standing on that bridge, looking back to the west. And here are these rocks gently dipping towards us. He crossed the river on the ferry went across and along the river, and he said he saw ledges or terraces of rocks that were dipping back to the southeast underneath the Old Red. So here's some scribblings from that excursion. This is west, that's east. Here's the Wye River.
So he has them all dipping the wrong way, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's got them, yeah, in his sketch, they're dipping the wrong way.
About right there, lower right-hand corner.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, this is east, that's west. That's, yeah, sorry about that. So here's the Wye River, Caversham Ferry, where he crossed. And what he's showing is heading back towards the Old Red. Here's the red. So crossing the River Wye, Caversham Ferry, and then he goes on and says stuff, and he's talking about the dip and everything. But he makes a sketch, and what we can derive from this is that it looks like a pretty orderly succession of rocks that are dipping gently underneath the Old Red. So he gets really excited about that. And I think he's a little disingenuous because I think he had some notes from other people that suggested that this might be the case. But there's his sketch. Once he leaves Bilth and he heads towards Ludlow, he stops in this lovely little village of Amistray, and the local reverend there is a fellow by the name of Lewis. And Reverend Lewis lived there all his life. He was an avid fossil collector, and he showed in his collections the succession of fossils he had collected from these gently dipping rocks. So this was in 1831. Here is a sketch from 1810 from Aiken's Proposals for Mineralogical Survey of Shropshire. And here are these gently dipping strata that Murchison just saw. So I think he had an inclination, if he'd done his homework, that that could be the case. But when he saw how fossiliferous they were, I think that's what nailed it. So here's another one of his sketches. Now that's south, now it's the right orientation. Here's the Amistry limestone. And here at least we see a little bit of credit. This is the first section with Lewis of Amistry. So he at least credits this Lewis guy for the stratigraphy. Then he also has the fossils that are there. And then 2, 3, 4, he doesn't have 2, 3, and 4 on here, but he has listed the fossils. So it's pretty clear he got that from Lewis in his notebook. Lewis had told him, here's the succession. So off he goes to Ludlow. Beautiful medieval town of Ludlow. Here's Ludlow Castle. Have a chance to walk through the castle.
So did he do that sketch?
No, this was somebody else. I can't remember who did this one. But here's the Teme River, T-E-M-E. Off in the distance is Titterstone Clee. This is capped by a dolerite sill. And then it's Old Red Sandstone with the Lake Carboniferous intrusive capping it. And that's why it's still there, because those dolerites are really... But you can see the outcrops along the river here, dipping back that way. Here's what it looks like. There's the castle, now abandoned. Here's the town of Ludlow, beautiful Tudor-style construction. And I can't remember the name of this hotel, but that's where, I'll get to that. One of the places that Lady Murchison and Sir Roderick visited was the Ludlow Museum, which was functioning at the time. In 1852, he came here and he gave a talk, and on his Silurian. And here is the guest book. Here's Mr. and Mrs. Murchison. And over here you can see where Reverend Lewis has signed in. And in the museum, they have under plastic, it looks like time has not been kind, but these are the actual 1852 props that Murchison brought with him to that meeting. Then he left them there, and they're fading a little bit. But if we look at them, we can see that at this time he's talking about Cambrian, so he's giving Murchison or Sedgwick something. And then he has his lower Silurian, Llandilo and Caradoc, and then upper Silurian, which is Wenlock and Ludlow, then going into the old red, the mountain limestone, and then the coal measures. And then this is looking west from down the axis of that little anticline that I referred to. And you can see the structure there. Then down here, so here's the Team River. Then down here is a river called the Ani River. We'll talk about that if we have time. So here is an early sketch, and then Lady Murchison came in and did the final version. So at this point, in the late 1840s, and at the time that he published published a big fat book called The Silurian System. And to him, a system meant a package of strata that represented an epoch of Earth history and had fossils that had a distinct start and stop, versus a system of Ely de Beaumont, which was one of these structural events. So system, the term was a little loosey-goosey compared to what it is today, and I think Sedgwick wrestled a little with that also. But so here is this sketch, and you can see that he had 4 parts to his Silurian system. Llandilo, which is largely slates, Caradoc, which is sandstones and shales, the Wenlock limestone, which is that beautiful hogback, and then the rocks around Ludlow going up to the old red. Here's the Caradoc. Here's the Wenlock edge. Here's the Ludlow hogback. So that looks pretty straightforward, doesn't it? So you really just had to go through and describe them. And here's his book. So published in 1839. Not bad, he'd started in 1831, and 8 years later had a big fat book published, ready to go. There's a Silurian system. Here's the preface. Having discovered that the region formerly inhabited by the Silures, celebrated in our annals for the defense of the great Caractacus, contained a vast and regular succession of undescribed deposits of a remote age. I have named them the Silurian system. The introductory chapter details the state of the subject, on. The first part embracing descriptive geology and so on. Now remember, he was a soldier, and the war ended way too soon for him. So here was his chance to become important, to become famous. And so, alluding to another great person who had done great things in this area, I'm going to name it the Silures. He really was sort of on a military footing. He was conquering territory. Not only for himself, but when he went to Russia and went to the European mainland, he went in search of Silurian. And when he found it, he basically planted a British flag on it and said, this is an intellectual empire building, just like the Brits were building an empire
So is that
physically.
geologic hammer a thing at the time?
I put that in there.
Okay. Just wanted to check.
It just seemed like,
Yes.
Better than a sword.
So as an allusion to Murchison, right?
Okay.
And later he was carried around and called, at a meeting in Wren's Nest where we'll be, he was, hail the king of Siluria. He just loved it. Just loved all the accolades. Lady Murchison did the artwork.
You did?
Yeah, she was amazing. And so here are some of the fossils and plate. The book's like that, right? And it's just got all these illustrations of field areas, of the fossils, and she did all of it. He could not have gotten this done as fast as he did without the help of Lady Murchison.
Is her name on the book too? Or just his?
I think he gives her credit, but yeah, no, she. And it looks like we may have to end with this today, but so he dedicates the volume to Reverend Adam Sedgwick. To you, my dear Sedgwick, a large portion of whose life has been devoted to the arduous study of the older British rocks, I dedicate this work. Having explored with you many a tract both at home and abroad, because they'd spent time in the Alps, and they'd done some reports together. Both of them by then had served as president of the Geological Society at least twice. They've done a lot of field work. Having explored with you many a tract both at home and abroad, I beg you to accept this offering as a memorial of friendship. And of the high sense I entertain of the value of your labor is yours most sincerely, Robert E. Murchison.
Okay. That's a great little name.
And also with that book, he published this map. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
That's a great middle name, Impey?
Impey, yeah. Do you have that name in your family?
I wish I did.
Yeah. So here's the Silurian region. Here are these hogbacks that we've been alluding to. So here's the old red. So here's the map outcrop area of the Silurian. And then the rest of Wales is up in here, and that was tossed. That was supposed to be Cambrian. So in 1834, Murchison and Sedgwick went out in the field together, leaving from Great Malvern, so they hooked up, went through some of Murchison's area, then they went out farther into Wales and looked at some of the older stuff. And Murchison was pretty upset with Sedgwick for not worrying more about fossils, but Sedgwick had his hands full with slaty cleavage and structure and rocks that didn't have a lot of fossils, were very fine-grained and black and slaty. And he didn't spend a lot of time. He had other things he was working on. He was ill quite a bit. And so Sedgwick really, and Sedgwick had this reputation. He was a great orator, brilliant guy, great orator, but he hated writing. So he seldom sat down and wrote things. He was supposed to write a talk that he and Murchison were jointly delivering at the British Association meeting. And 2 days before, there's a letter 2 days before that Sedgwick gets from Murchison saying, I can't go in and do this without a script. And so they canceled their paper, and Murchison wasn't happy. And so he just had this reputation of being smart and doing a lot of work, but not really getting much of it done and written up. And Murchison, after he gave credit or gave a nod in his dedication, said, look, get this Cambrian system thing done. One of the problems was he didn't know where the top of the Cambrian was. They had gone out, and when they'd see these black slates, they just assumed that everything was dipping this way. And so the farther west they went, the deeper they were getting into this deep, deep pile of Cambrian rocks. As it turns out, it was more like that, and so some of the rocks even way, way out west were actually the same age as the Caradoc, the lower Silurian. So anyway, we're out of time. We'll pick up with the controversy and its final conclusion next time. Okay? Mike, I didn't mean to
It's kind of
ignore
funny
you.
that Sedgwick was the academic who wouldn't write. Murchison was more of the self-taught guy
Yeah,
who published.
that's right.
Kind of opposite what we would
Yeah,
expect.
yeah, except Murchison was highly aggressive and ambitious. To him, this was the most important thing that could ever be done.
So they have a big fight that's coming up.
Coming up, yeah.
I love fights.
Okay. All right.
Great
so,
job.
Thank you. See you next time.
Where's Randy? He
His-
take his son.
Yeah, he had a family thing come up.
So how bad was the falling out?
Pretty bad. It only lasted 30 years though, until they died. So.
Till they die.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, if I was out in all that black slate, I'd just be going, forget it.
Thank you.
Okay, see ya.
It interests me that some of us are tool users, we use them when people provide and apply it. The Ghost Mountain is the ones that read those, for the foundation stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Will wants to do a PowerPoint. I don't know if we're gonna get to go to England, but she and I've been, her more than me, been listening to a book on, two books on Richard Owen.
If you want to do a talk on Owen, that'd be awesome.
We decided he's a lot better than he got credit for.
It's
Oh, you
kind
like
of
him?
like,
Just don't
Oh,
like him?
yeah.
the one thing
Yeah.
it says is that the winners get to rewrite history. And so the Darwinians kind of wrote him out like
You
he
mean
had
like
no
T.H. Huxley?
impact. What?
You mean like Huxley?
Yeah, Huxley hated him.
Yeah.
He had a vendetta against him even before Darwin released
All
Origin
right.
of Species.
Yeah, if you want to do a
It
PowerPoint,
was-
that'd
it is
be awesome.
fascinating.
Well,
That'd be
we
great.
found the most interesting stuff
Yeah,
about it.
share
Like-
with us, that'd be great.
Like when he, he was studying to be a doctor.
Yeah.
And so he was going into the prisons and getting the cadavers. And he had an experience where two ghosts
Spirits
of the
cadavers.
bodies showed up, and he was so scared and left, and he said, I am never touching another Christian again.
Okay.
Christian cadaver.
Yeah,
Also,
that'd be
the
awesome.
thing we're on now, he was instrumental in getting science the clout over,
Right, government.
over law and over the church for deciding what was true. It was over the big sea monster controversy. Because these people would come back to Bush and they'd all testify in court, and he'd say, no, their testimony's irrelevant. Where's the proof? Where's the scientific evidence?
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Wasn't he also helpful in getting funded positions for scientists to show that it was something that was worth government paying?
Yeah, it's implied that he didn't have a lot of followers. Yes, he did. He had a lot of students that loved him, and yeah, he had an ego. But also, I always thought he was born rich. He was born poor. His
Oh, was
dad
he?
was a merchant who lost a lot of money because Napoleon reneged on his debts. And
Sea monsters ate his boat.
yeah, his mom was French.
Oh,
He was fluent in French.
And he's the one that basically built the Natural History Museum, right?
He was, and one of the
Yeah,
reasons
so that'd be
he's
interesting too.
he actually was thinking, he was pro-evolution. He just didn't think natural selection was complete enough. But one of the things it says in the Wikipedia article is some of the current revelations and discoveries about evolution and stuff are starting to agree with some of his ideas.
Yeah, Huxley had a real bone to pick with religion, and anybody who countenanced a religious view was on his hit list, so I can
Yeah,
see
and
why
the book
Owen
said that
was-
he only, great dude, not coronavirus. He stuck with the basic view because the church was involved in helping funding the museum he was trying to start. But that he actually got some people mad at him because there were times he wanted to insist man's difference wasn't his divine spirit, but that his brain was so much more advanced. I mean, it's fascinating how much
Yeah.
we've learned about
So when
it.
do you want to do that? 2 weeks from now? Is that too short a time, or is that?
No, that's
That'd be
okay.
good.
Okay, let's do 2 weeks from
I'll
today.
help you make it, but you can present it. You listen to more of the book than me.
Well, there's, okay,
And if something changes, let me know.
his
we can-
son, his grandson, wrote 2 books about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he had he saved everything anybody ever wrote to
Well,
him.
that makes it easy.
Had his wife had a diary that she kept,
Nice.
and he made additions to her diary whenever, there was something that needed to be.
It's a lot of primary stuff to.
He was buddies with Charles Dickens.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, he was just,
Yeah, that would be awesome.
oh, I want to show you this before you escape. I know you
I've got
probably-
an appointment at 5:30, I gotta go.
This is from my blog. I drew the animals. Did you go to that lecture?
I did.
I drew the animals from it,
Oh, wow.
from my blog, what he taught us.
Yeah, good.
And this is the one
Oh,
that
nice.
with the 13 now, 23, 53.
pretty amazing. Finding
It was.
accretions and then boom,
Wow.
everywhere. I wanna go over there and get a couple of those.
Cool.
Yeah,
They should be findable, right? I doubt
Yeah,
they
it
collected
should be.
all of them.
Yeah. But he says though that it's private property and city property.
Okay, city property works. Or is there a lot, I guess there are things with further roads, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and he said, aren't you worried about,
More people.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess that would. But